They burned my house and called the cops on me. Yeah, you heard that right. One minute I'm coughing up black smoke in the middle of what's left of my grandfather's old cabin, and the next I've got this woman, Helen Clark, strutting up like she's running a board meeting at my funeral. She looked me dead in the eye, didn't even flinch, and said, "Non-compliance has consequences, even for you." Like my whole life going up in flames was just some lesson in neighborly morality. And the cops, well, they showed up, sure, but all they did was flip through her folder, thicker than a Bible, while I stood there covered in soot, trying to explain I didn't burn down my own place. Looking back, maybe I should have laughed, but I was too busy holding myself together, trying not to lose my mind. The smell of burnt wood was still in my hair when Helen came knocking on my motel door at 5 in the morning. Couldn't sleep anyway. I'd spent the whole night staring at photos of what used to be our fishing cabin. I was expecting maybe a little sympathy. What I got was Helen, clipboard in hand, business suit crisp, laying out a stack of papers on my little table. She launched right into her routine, barely pausing to see if I was actually awake. "This incident highlights ongoing property maintenance violations," she declared, her voice all business, flipping through those papers like she was about to ask me to sign a merger contract. I couldn't believe it. 12 hours after my house burned down, and here she was, rattling off grass height violations and mailbox placement infractions, as if that mattered more than the fact I had nowhere left to sleep. She'd been keeping a file on me, building a case, probably since before the first wisp of smoke curled out of my window. It should have been a red flag, but grief has a way of making you slow on the uptake. That file, she spread it out like evidence at a trial. Official stamps, legalese, threats dressed up as friendly advice. Stuff about escalating enforcement measures, protecting property values. You know the type. Then Mrs. Patterson, from across the street, wandered over and let something slip that chilled me. Helen used to work collections for a foreclosure agency, targeting folks who fell behind, especially if they didn't know the fine print. Suddenly her confidence, the legal threats, all of it made sense, but it didn't explain how she got her hands on details about my mortgage, my insurance, even some of my bank records. What HOA president is supposed to know how much you owe or when your payments are late? Helen stood in my ash heap, stamping forms and snapping photos for her so-called compliance monitoring records. She even called the police, right in front of me, to say I'd set the fire myself to dodge a foreclosure she'd already started behind my back. The responding officer was confused, flipping through her pile of paperwork like he'd stumbled into a white-collar crime scene instead of a house fire. "Ma'am, this is a lot of paperwork for a neighbor complaint," he said, eyeing the documents and enforcement timelines. Turns out, Helen had absolutely no legal authority to start a foreclosure, but she kept on quoting HOA covenants and statutes, spinning words that sounded official but meant nothing. Watching her argue with law enforcement in the ruins of my grandfather's place, I started realizing this wasn't about the neighborhood. It was about control, intimidation, and maybe a bigger plan than anyone suspected. She didn't stop. Helen measured foundation lines, took pictures of burnt beams, even filled out inspection forms like the place was still standing. That officer, though, he started taking notes, asked Helen straight out how she'd gotten private banking info no HOA should have. I could tell he was thinking what I was thinking. This was organized, maybe even criminal. By the time Helen left, I knew this wasn't random. She'd been gathering info for months, targeting people like me. People who might not know their rights, or who just wanted to be left alone. The next morning, I drove straight to the bank. Peterson, the manager, went pale when I told him what happened. He pulled out a thick folder, trembling, and admitted they'd nearly frozen my account after getting what looked like official HOA requests, except those papers were forgeries. Helen had fake power of attorney, tried to get full access to my records, and it turns out she'd tried the same thing with at least 3 other families, all of them minorities with nice lakefront properties. The security team discovered she'd used professional skip tracing, credit monitoring, even checked our employment histories. Her paperwork had real notary seals, official-sounding references, good enough to fool even experienced bank staff. I sat there holding those fake documents, wondering how many families she'd hurt before someone caught on. Back at the property, I started noticing stuff I'd never seen before. Electrical wires in the tree line that didn't belong, little camouflage boxes that turned out to be hidden cameras. Grant Clark, a local teenager, showed up sweating and fumbling, trying to explain he was just testing some electronics. But the panic in his voice said otherwise. That's when Lucas Reed, another neighbor, pulled me aside, looking over his shoulder like he was in a spy movie. He whispered that Helen had Grant installing cameras and documenting everything: mail, visitors, our routines. She convinced Grant it was for community security, but in reality, it was professional surveillance on every family she wanted to squeeze out. Helen kept detailed profiles on us: when we left the house, who visited, who worked late, even which families might fight back versus fold. This wasn't paranoia. She'd turned HOA management into organized harassment, picking off families one by one. And I realized, maybe the fire was no accident, just Plan B. Then it got federal. Monday morning, I get an IRS audit letter. Helen had filed bogus 1099s, claiming she paid me thousands for vacation rental coordination on my burned-down cabin. My family property was suddenly described as a criminal enterprise. The IRS agent, Morrison, could see the paperwork was fishy. She paused when I cited constitutional violations, like due process and targeted audits. When I explained how civil rights laws protect against this kind of systematic targeting, she agreed to halt the audit and dig into Helen's evidence. Turns out, every family Helen went after had the same kind of paperwork problems, the same fake violations, the same demographic profile. And as soon as I started asking questions about due process, about the HOA's real authority, Helen kicked off a campaign around the neighborhood. She put up flyers, encouraged neighbors to report suspicious activity, and told them how to document my so-called unreported income. She made herself the face of community standards, but all she was doing was targeting the same kind of families, over and over. Wednesday, I get a call from Richardson, a federal banking examiner. He tells me Helen's been submitting fake mortgage applications, trying to trigger foreclosures on high-value lakefront homes. Always the same kind of owners, always for the best lots. Richardson spelled it out: crossing state lines, using mail and wire fraud, targeting minorities. That's federal conspiracy, not just neighbor trouble. As I traced my property line, holding my grandfather's deed in one hand and a piece of charred wood in the other, I had to ask myself, do I stay and fight, or to just let her win? But then came threats, anonymous messages referencing my federal job, hinting that troublemakers lose security clearances, their livelihoods. She, or someone working with her, had done their homework on me, and I knew I wasn't the only one at risk. I cornered Lucas and laid it out: federal crimes, man. You keep quiet, you're part of it. Are you willing to go to prison to protect someone who's using you? He broke, told me about Helen's cut from every forced sale, her files on everyone, her resistance ratings, how she ranked families by how much fight she thought they had left. She'd promised him a slice of every property she flipped after harassing the owners out. It got even bigger. The federal banking task force called. They'd found mortgage fraud attempts on 7 other homes, all owned by minority families who'd bought in the last few years. The Civil Rights Division got involved. They saw the pattern: targeted enforcement, fake violations, financial fraud, all focused on making this lakefront exclusive again. And it wasn't just me. The Martinez family, the Johnsons, the Chins, each got the same threats, the same violation notices, the same feeling of being watched, pushed out, their dreams dismantled piece by piece. Eva Brooks, the fire marshal, confirmed it. The fire at my place was no accident. Accelerants, burn patterns meant to look like an accident, and she'd found 2 more suspicious fires in the same neighborhood, all families on Helen's list. I coordinated evidence, leaned on my civil rights background, and finally had enough to go full federal. Multiple agencies got involved: bank fraud, arson, IRS, FBI. My biggest worry: if I came out as a federal prosecutor, Helen might use it against me, threaten my career. But it was the only way. At the Monday task force meeting, I introduced myself, laid out every pattern, every law violated, every family targeted. They moved fast. The Civil Rights Division handled discrimination charges. The banking fraud team dug into mortgage manipulation. Arson investigators built their case. It all came together at Helen's compliance presentation at the community center. She was on stage, showing off her successes: forced sales, demographic adjustments, property value charts. The room was packed, and people were scared. until Agent Williams stepped up with the warrant. Helen Clark, you're under arrest for federal civil rights conspiracy, banking fraud, and arson, he said, as her charts hit the floor. She freaked, pointed right at me, screaming about federal prosecutors, about how everything she documented for compliance was now evidence against her. It was poetic. The same paperwork she used to threaten us had become the rope that hanged her. Grant, the teen who helped with surveillance, was charged under federal law but got a shot at rehabilitation for his cooperation. Lucas got protection in exchange for testimony. The rest of us, the families, got our property rights restored, liens erased, legal fees paid. Helen? She's looking at 25 years, no parole. Lake access is now a federally protected right here. Civil rights classes are mandatory for every resident. The dock my grandfather built is back, stronger than ever. Families of every color swim in the lake. Their kids laughing on the docks, they almost lost. So, yeah, Helen's master plan? All she did was write her own indictment. Maybe that's the lesson. When people weaponize rules to bully their neighbors, they end up building the very case that takes them down. If you made it this far, I want to hear your thoughts. What would you have done? Ever had to stand up to someone with power who thought the rules didn't apply to them? Drop a comment below, and if this story struck a nerve, hit that thanks button. And remember, keep your eyes open, keep your paperwork clean, and for God's sake, keep your matches far away from other people's dreams.